So welcome to part 2 of the Metaphysics 101 series, which is a lead-in to the Towards a Grown-Up God video series on this Facebook page. Basically, before we jump into the entire series of videos, I wanted to lay out a few of the concepts that are used in Unity and New Thought Christianity, which is where I'm from, and where a lot of the concepts I'll draw on, a lot of the terminology I'll be utilizing. So I wanted to just make a simple couple of videos that will give you a heads up on it. So if you haven't already seen part 1, go back to it. The link is below, and just acquaint yourself with it. First, we talked about how the Bible is used in 4 different ways. First, literally by a lot of mainline churches. Then, a lot of times, it's looked at in a historical and cultural context at the time it was written, what was going on in Israel and things like that at the time these stories took place. Then we talked about them metaphorically, which is how these stories can be used, especially the Jesus stories, to illustrate how to act in our interrelationships with other people. The example I've used a lot is how Jesus was betrayed by Judas and how Jesus acted in it, and talk about how there are times in our lives when we're all betrayed by somebody, and how to conduct ourselves and how to live our lives. And then finally we talked about the way that's mostly used in Unity and other New Thought Christian groups, and that's looking at it beyond the surface or metaphysically. I went into how each name, place, and thing in Scripture can relate to our spiritual journey. And I talk about how in Unity we look at the Scripture as being a journey from the Adamic to the Christ, meaning from Adam, a very earthy person, driven by his senses, to working toward a spiritual journey where we achieve this connection with the divine, the Christos, the Christ within us. How we can choose love in any particular situation, really. So, having said that, in this video, I thought I'd give you a practical, in-depth idea of what a typical biblical metaphysical interpretation actually looks like, and show how it relates, actually both metaphysically and metaphorically, to our lives, both inner and outer. So I thought I would use one of the most familiar and recognizable biblical stories there is, the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden from the book of Genesis. And you all pretty much know this story, how on the 6th day God declares his intention to make somebody in his own image, and he creates humankind. He fashions a man out of dust and forms a woman out of the man's rib. Then God places these 2 people, Adam and Eve, in the idyllic Garden of Eden, encouraging them to procreate and to enjoy the world that God created for them fully, with one caveat. He forbid them to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And you know what happens. In the garden, Eve encounters a crafty serpent who convinces her to eat the tree's forbidden fruit, assuring her that she will not suffer if she does. And Eve gives the fruit to Adam, and the 2 are immediately filled with shame and remorse, realizing that they're naked. But by walking in the garden, God discovers this disobedience. And after cursing the serpent, he turns and curses the couple. He tells Eve that she will be cursed to suffer painful childbirth and must submit to her husband's authority. And then Adam is cursed to toil and work in the ground for food. And then the 2 are then banished from the Garden of Eden, and an angel, a cherubim, is placed at the eastern gate to guard the garden. Now, I'm not going to go into a whole topic about origin stories, that how all cultures have them, and where this fits with the others. And I'm also really not going to get into the gender politics. A little bit will be touched on later. For this, I just really want to show how these things work out metaphysically. You'll get a lot of that other stuff as the Grown Up God series commences. So the first step in doing a metaphysical interpretation is to unpack the meanings behind each of the names, the places, and the other words and elements that show up in it. And in Unity and New Thought, we use a couple of books written by the co-founder of Unity, Charles Fillmore, and they're the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary and the Revealing Word. I'll put a Google Doc up with both the links to those. There are free PDFs of those books available, and also breaking these concepts down further. But one of the things that we do in doing this sort of thing is we don't necessarily stick to the official Fillmore metaphysical terms. And other writers in Unity and New Thought have gone on and built on them and modernized them. And also, one of the aspects which we'll get to in this video is we're encouraged to do a personal metaphysical interpretation as well. In fact, when I was in seminary, my program was 4 years. Well, the first 3, I actually had to put together my own version of the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary, literally taking most, if not almost all, of the names and places and terms and doing my own interpretation. I filled one of those nice thick notebooks over those 3 years. Unfortunately, I lost that to time and countless moves and a home fire, and I would give my right arm to have my original copy of that. So let's go over these terms, and like I said, I'll provide a Google Doc and go into more detail as this progresses. There'll be a link, and there'll also be a link to the PDFs of the, actually I think it's an online and not a PDF, but an online linking where you can look at each of the terms and search for them in the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary or the Revealing Word. So the first term is Adam, and now before I go into this, this isn't like the be and end all of a metaphysical interpretation, because the names and stuff have sometimes multiple meanings and multiple uses in various stories. And even in this story, if I were doing a completely different angled interpretation of this, might be different. But for the purpose of the one I'm doing here, Adam represents generic man, or all of us. It's sort of a universal story that happens to us. It goes back into the cultural thing of origin stories in mythos. So the word man itself represents our thought processes. Now these thought processes can be either spiritual, higher thoughts, thinking about God, or they can be low, based on our sensuality, the ego, anger, vindictiveness. Woman represents our feeling nature. So Eve represents our feelings and Adam represents our thoughts. The Garden of Eden can be best described as the realm of consciousness where our thoughts are in harmony with only God's thoughts. It's the perfect ideal state to be in. In New Testament Christianity, the idea would be what Jesus talked about, the kingdom of heaven. It's a state of bliss. So a place where there's no separation between the sacred and the secular, where everything, every act, every thought process, everything is in tuned to the idea that it's all one, that we're all connected to God and each other. So then there is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And this is something that kind of knocks us out of that state of the kingdom of heaven, of pure bliss and pure God. It's sort of like a Schrodinger's cat notion. It's a state of consciousness where we believe both in good, or God, and something equally as powerful as God, which we deem as being evil. And, here in straight Christianity, we have God that's supposed to be all powerful and all knowing, and yet we've created the devil or Satan, which is supposed to be a being that's as equally powerful. I'll get into that in one of the further talks when we talk about these things and these concepts, and how historically Satan, that person, didn't really exist, and it came about later, and it's a creation of man to put the fear of into people to follow God. So this is an error in thought, and we talk in Unity and New Thought a lot about error thinking. And another name for error thinking is sin. And I'll get further into that a lot later too. But basically, the concept of sin is a mistaken belief that there is anything other than a connection to God or good in the world. And I know this is confusing right now, but as we move through the entire Grown Up God series, ideas like this will become more clearer. So kind of just bear with me. We'll get a little bit of that later in this video too. So the serpent represents these lower sensual thoughts that tempt us away from our higher nature, away from thinking about God or being connected to spirit. It can also be thought of as our ego, or that little voice that sits, that little monkey voice that sits on the shoulder, kind of trying to tempt us away from things. When we're cut off in traffic and we're like, that mofo really deserves me to go beat the heck out of him for cutting me off, or this is going to now ruin my day, as opposed to going to a higher thought of just like letting the guy go, bless you on your journey, I'm sure you had to be there someplace more important than me, and I'm going to move on and not be consumed by this anger that I have. So that ego, that serpent, is that little monkey chattering voice. So the awareness of our nakedness can be said to represent the shame that we often feel when we know that whatever choice in life we made was less than spiritual, than less than noble, than less than holy. It's kind of guilt. We know that we screwed up. And again, this will come into play when we talk about what sin is. So the cherubim represents a protection of our spiritual core, to protect us, that higher self, from the ego. If you think of that graphic image of the little devil on one shoulder and a little angel on the other, that's it. An angel voice is going, shut up. That's not right. Just let it go. It's not worth it. This isn't a hill you want to die on if it's a relationship issue or something. So that's sort of like the counter to the ego, sort of like the good ego voice, and the serpent's the bad ego voice. So east is another term that comes up that plays an important role. In scriptural symbology, east represents the within, turning to God, meditation, prayer, tuning in to that inner voice. It's basically shutting out the outside world and focusing on our inner life. So if we take these various metaphysical terms and then rewrite the story of the fall, we see that this story is a universal or generic Adam type story about how we sometimes allow our feeling nature, women, to be lured by the ego, which is represented by the serpent, into a belief that there's something better than maybe to trust our inner connection to God, or trust our higher self, or trust our voice, inner voice. And this results in the fact that we're no longer in harmony with the Garden of Eden, with God. We feel shame, we feel guilt, and that's being naked when we realize what we've done, when we have our oh crap moment, what have I done? The walk of shame the next day you might have in certain situations. So that consequence of this is that we feel separated from our good. We feel separated from God, kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And we're sort of left to wander. And we're trapped within our own heads, our own flesh, our own clothing of skin. We think, here we are, and God hates me for whatever I just did, if you believe in that sort of concept of an anthropomorphic God that judges. So you feel judged by God, or you feel judged by your friends, you feel judged by your family for whatever actions is going on. So I bet you're wondering, I hope you're not, I hope you already have an idea, but I bet you're wondering what a story like this has to do with the real world. Well, as I mentioned, when we look at the Bible as a journey of our spiritual development, from perhaps somebody who starts out sort of very shallow and surface dwelling, concerned with, the acquisition of power or money or sex or whatever, or being very hedonistic, or really just believing in, your mind itself, that there's nothing else, that sort of mentality. But something sometimes happens where we get into trouble, and it may lead to an addiction or another hardship, and we kind of hit bottom, and we realize that we should turn to spiritual higher ideas. And the Garden of Eden story could also sort of represent emotional development too. I use this story often to talk about like childhood development. At some point in our lives, when we were kids, we ignored the warnings of our parents and we paid a price for it. And this is a universal theme of childhood. In fact, one could argue that we're supposed to have this happen. We're supposed to screw up and start getting out from under our parents and start learning to figure things out on our own. It's how we grow and develop into an adulthood and hopefully become parents ourselves. Now, these stories can be different for everybody, and sometimes the transgressions are serious, and maybe you're running with the law or something like that, but a lot of times, at least when we're children, they're really minor ones. I've kind of noticed there's sort of a universal theme that often it involves fire. In fact, the first time that I was grounded as a kid that I recall was because I was caught playing with fire and I was punished. So that's not the story I'm going to tell, because that's pretty much all of it that I can remember. But I'm going to take you into this sort of story version of this right now. In the beginning, we are at some extremely young age sitting at a kitchen table. It's a warm, peaceful environment. We might have just got home from school, and we're sitting at the table enjoying milk, and Mom made us fresh baked cookies. And Mom's standing at the counter chopping vegetables to cook dinner to make a stew. Now, I know this is sort of like naive, wait till your father gets home, 1950s, 1970s kind of thing. For some of us of a certain age, we did grow up with our mom being a housewife at home and doing this. So we're in this idyllic kitchen setting, safe, warm, loved. But nearby looms the ultimate childhood temptation, the lit stove. And the burner is on, and it's waiting for a pot to be set on it. And there's these tendrils of flame, if you have a gas stove, that are dancing up and down, yellow, red, and blue. Or if it's an electric burner, it's got that red glow coming off of it. And to our young eyes, this seems almost hypnotic, especially if it is the gas flame going like that, kind of dancing. So Mother looks over and sees that look in her eyes, that almost hypnotic look, and says, don't you ever think about touching a lit stove, honey. You'll hurt yourself. That's for grown-ups to use. Don't worry about it. In fact, here, have another cookie. So maybe this is the first time in your life where you actually ever heard your mom say no to you. And you're surprised, and you trust her. So you look away for a minute or two, but, you think, and you start to hear this voice in your head, how can something so pretty, that ring of dancing colors, be so bad? So in that instant, you ignore, maybe for the first time in your life, your loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful parent and what they've said. You have entered into this uncharted territory of eating of the forbidden fruit. of doubting your parents. And maybe you give in to this temptation, this pretty light, and your mom steps out of the room, maybe the doorbell rings or the mail comes, and you start to reach out to touch that seductive dancing. Ow! So here contained in the kitchen are all the same elements of the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent. You know, first we have this version of the Garden of Eden, which is the kitchen, and childhood, this idyllic realm before we know wounds or boo-boos that are yet to come in our lives. We know nothing but love, joy, fresh-baked cookies. This is, as some philosophers and poets have said, the period before we know death. And there's our own all-powerful, all-loving parent that has given us so many wonderful things in our lives. Yet there's this one thing in this kitchen, this magical realm of milk and homemade cookies that we're warned is bad for us, that we cannot have. We can have anything else. We can have more cookies in this world that we desire. Yet there's one thing that's denied of us, and it's so seductive and so tempting, this dancing color. So we hear this little voice inside of our heads that says, come on, go ahead and touch it. It's pretty, isn't it? You know, your mom is keeping this from you because it's something that only grown-ups can use, and if you touch it, if you use it, if you tame it, then you'll become a grown-up too. And she's only telling you that because she can't boss you around anymore. You want to be a grown-up, don't you? So what is the result of this sort of blatant disregard of our parents' warning? Well, first comes pain. For the first time in our lives, maybe, we know something other than joy and happiness and goodness, a thing that we have been protected from. And then we may feel shame and fear about getting caught for not listening to our parents. You know, if we were lucky, we didn't scream in pain. Maybe we just burned our fingertip and we kind of did that. But now we're hiding it behind our back. You know, we're hoping mom doesn't see it. Maybe our face is red and we're trying, but it hurts. But we hope mom won't notice. But, you know, parents being what they are, they can tell when we're trying to hide something. So after she puts liniment and a bandage on it, which we could think about as that clothing of skin in Scripture, she'll probably send us to a room in punishment for not listening to her. And as a result of this, life is not as wonderful and as pain-free as it was before. And here's the kicker, that no matter how many times as we grow older that we're told no, or it's for our own good by our parents, you know, there's always going to be something to tempt us. Some sweet voice will say, maybe this time your parents are actually wrong. So we'll keep reaching out for tempting things until we finally get to an age where we learn to discern and understand what's best for our own good, or we start to remember the advice our parents said about doing certain things and avoiding certain things, and maybe not till we're 30 or 40 or 50 do we actually get that message and go, you know, man, I wish I had listened to mom and dad back then. It might have saved me a world of hurt. So, you know, you can look at this also as, like I said, as the idea of stopping listening to that still small voice, the higher power, that message from God, and we'll get into that later. And, you know, there have been instances in my own life where I've chosen to ignore these warnings of my higher power. And one of them that comes to mind, and it's an illustration that I've used repeatedly, it isn't some massive temptation of the flesh. It was actually ignoring that still small voice of spirit in favor of an easier, more seductive voice of sheer, unadulterated laziness. So when we're going to go back to like the 80s, my first car that I actually paid for and owned myself with my own money, actually I leased it, was a brand new Dodge Neon. Remember the smiley car, the smiley front end? This was the first time in my life, and I think even now the only time where I've been the original owner of the car. And it was like the second year that this car had been in the market. And I don't know if you realize that, but it's usually around the second year of a new car's run that it becomes a big target for thieves, because parts are starting to wear out, airbags are starting to go, so the black market is if you own a second year model of a new model of a car, your insurance rates are going to be higher too, because people know that these things tend to be the market for car thieves. So knowing this and living in Detroit, where I've lived most of my life, I owned a club, the anti-theft club device. And this was early on where airbags were kind of newer in cars, and they were the airbag thing was bulky. And it was a pain in the ass really to put the bar over this. And it was something that would get frustrating, and it could actually take 5-10 minutes sometimes of me fighting with it to get it on. So there was this one evening, I stopped at home to grab a bite to eat before heading for a meeting. And I only planned to be there a few minutes. I literally was going to make a sandwich, look at my mail, check my answering machine while I'm eating the sandwich, and walk out the door, back on the road. So I pull up in front of my flat, and I hear that still small voice of spirit telling me, Michael, put your club on. But again, it's something that at that time seemed to take so long to jiggle and get into position on this car that it was honestly a pain in the ass. And I basically remember this to this day, arguing with the still small voice without even necessarily realizing what it was. It was like my gut instinct or something, saying, I'm only going to be in the house probably shorter than it's going to take me to put the thing on there. So I'm not going to do it. So I walk in my house, and the first thing I do is check my answering machine, and it turns out the thing that I was going to leave for the meeting got canceled. So I didn't think twice about it. I went back in the back of the house and started reading or working on a project or whatever. And 2-3 hours later, I walk out to grab a breath of fresh air, and I see the spot in front of my house where my car used to be. So that tempting voice of laziness really cost me a heck of a lot of money and a period of joy. And it would have been so much different if I had just put that damn thing on, and because I listened to that still small voice. So one way we can look at the story is that it shows how humanity came to put more importance on our thoughts, our intellect, rather than our feeling nature or our heart, because we've had times where we doubted it and it led us astray because we're listening to this still small voice. And that's also what I think the idea of the punishment of Eve really is. That whole thing where Scripture says that God says that women will be cursed to suffer painful childbirth and must submit to their husband's authority. So, metaphysically to me, that really means the painful childbirth part can be thought of as a notion that our feeling nature will sometimes bring us pain. The pain of grief, the pain of loss, of loneliness, heartbreak, because the feeling nature is where love comes from. So if we love, we risk heartache. Now, this is that thing that I find really BS, is that, mainline Christianity will use the punishment of Eve or the temptation of Eve as an excuse to subjugate women. Reality is, it represents the age-old argument of thought versus feeling, and how that plays out individually and in society as whole. We tend to value our ideas and our thoughts over our feelings. We're told women are too emotional is an argument that gets up, or that we're too emotional if we follow our feelings. There's that old dragnet TV show, just the facts, ma'am. So we give more credence to our thoughts than to our feeling nature. And we're enculturated to not to trust our gut instinct, our intuition, or that still small voice, or that connection to God within. On a side note, one of the things I'm planning to add to this whole grown-up God material is some sort of a virtual form of a 6-week class I created a long time ago called Knowing God, Knowing Ourselves, and Knowing Each Other, on how to learn to distinguish the unique way the universe speaks to you, whether you call it the still small voice or call it your intuition or your gut, and learning to trust your gut. Basically, how to figure out how that is to you, because I believe everybody has a different way of doing things. Some people hear a chime, which was my phone actually going off for an email, but I've heard it described that some people, when they know they're in the right space and right time, have like a mental ping going on in their head. Me, I do tend to hear a voice that kind of originates somewhere down in the gut or the heart space. But it took years to figure it out, mostly by making mistakes and screwing up by like that. It's like I literally heard something telling me to put the club on the car, and I ignored it. And after enough times of ignoring it, you kind of get the feeling that maybe you should give it a listen or two. So as soon as I figure out a way to structure and how to do it, and if I do it as a small group and do it with Zoom, because we are in COVID land, if you are seeing this video years from now, this is right in 2020 in November at the height of COVID. So if I figure out how to do this Zoom-wise, I'm going to make this available as something that we can do. Now, the common idea that this story is used in mainline evangelical traditional Christianity, it's the story of how sin enters into the world. And we can say the same thing in Unity and New Thought, that this is about sin, but the difference is in how we view what sin is and what the consequences of it are. So the word sin actually comes from the Greek word hamartia, Hamartia. It's actually an archery term which just simply means missing the mark, making a mistake. So in Unity, we say that all sin stems from error thinking. It's a mistaken belief that we're separate from God and each other. And we act from that belief system. You know, the idea is that if I realize that my neighbor and I are one, or my partner and I are really one, or God and I are really one, is that if I think these things, I won't act in a way that hurts the other person. If I love my neighbors, if I realize that my enemies and I are one, then I'll be less inclined to wish harm and want harm on them. If I believe that I am good, if I don't have a notion that God hates me, I might live my life in a different way than if I believe that I'm a dirty sinner or God hates me, or because I did something wrong or made a mistake in my life that punishing God is disowned me, which is not the concept of God in Unity and New Thought. And there's one other more part of the story, and it's the ending. Now, when we left Adam and Eve, they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, and the cherubim, an angel, was set to guard the eastern gate. Now, we kind of think that this idea is that the angel is posted to keep Adam and Eve out. But actually, it's just the opposite. The cherubim, the angel, is protecting that state and waiting for us to let us back in anytime we're ready. Because having tasted that idyllic internal state when we are connected to God, when we realize we have a connection to our inner life, spirit, when we're in the kingdom of heaven, when we're in that good, happy place, we really do want to get back in. We want to attune, reunite with that higher nature. So the idea is, this is where the word east comes into play. The cherubim is protecting the eastern gate of the Garden of Eden. Metaphysically, in biblical language, east is always, and I think it predates unity and new thought, east is symbolic for that state of consciousness within us, for going within, for prayer, for meditation, for turning in, to tune in, to listen to the still small voice. So when you see east in metaphysical literature or mystical literature, it's symbolic of turning within. So what it's saying is that the guardian is holding the space for us, and the kingdom of heaven is there if we just turn within. I found a New Thought minister by the name of Reverend Dr. Noel McInnes years ago wrote this lovely story that symbolizes this that I'd like to read to you. It's called, obviously, Return to Eden. "Wait a minute," Eve said to Adam after they had journeyed several miles from the Garden of Eden. "We don't have to continue this trip." But God said, "Yes," Eve spoke decisively, "and until we heard what God said, we didn't know that being out here was an option. We didn't even know that options existed until we ate the apple. How could we have known? We were just there. We're not there now," Adam was bitter. "God kicked us out for good." "No, we can go back," Eve said with a certainty that astonished Adam. "How?" By choosing to go back. But God said, "Yes," Eve asserted. And what God said is a choice that we don't have to accept. I'm just now seeing this whole business of making choices well enough to use it rightly. For instance, Adam challenged, like I already said, we didn't even know that the choice to be out here was available until God chose it for us. How does that change anything? Adam was unconvinced. Now that I see how we've always been at the disposal of choices that weren't our own, I also see the power that knowing about choices gives us. Enough power, I suppose, to convince God to let us back in? Exactly. You're suggesting that God will take us back simply because we choose to go back. Especially because we choose to go back. That's just it. We weren't in the garden by our choice before. We were, Eve searched for the right words and shrugged. It's like I said, we were just there. We were put there, with no idea that there was an alternative. No idea that we could choose whether or not to be there. I get it. You think that God would appreciate having us around again if we were there by our choice? I'm sure of it, Eve declared. So the two retraced their steps to Eden, building a case for readmission. "We're back," they called to God when they reached the edge of the garden. "So I see," God greeted them. "And just what is it that brings you back so soon?" Emboldened even further by the absence of sternness in God's voice, even Adam came right to the point of their newfound understanding of the power of choice. "We realize," Eve declared, "that banishment is a choice we don't have to accept. The further we walked, the clearer it seemed to me that we were headed for a lot of things that we have no desire to choose from." "In other words," said Adam, "from what you've made it possible for us to learn about choices and their consequences, we've learned that being anywhere else but with you isn't worth choosing." After a pondered silence, God declared, "It's really good to have you back," but then added in quiet afterthought, "You sure did cut one hell of a story short, though." But that's the point of this all. It's free will. We have a choice to tune in to that still small voice. We have a choice to opt for our higher nature, our Christ consciousness. We have a choice to return to the Garden of Eden, that idyllic state of trust and love, anytime there's a situation that can try to knock us out of it. We can be driving to the zoo with our kids and some asshole cuts us off, And we could be angry and stressed out and not enjoy the trip because we're letting that get a hold of us. We're having that still small voice, or that's asshole, SOB, and road rage him and whatever. Or we can just go, I'm not going to let this ruin my day with my family. I'm going to enjoy the zoo. I don't care. That guy probably had a better place to go. Or that guy's an asshole, but who cares? He has no power over me. So that's, like I said, that's the point. We can get back into the garden, the idyllic state, anytime we want if we choose to. So I hope this gives you an idea of how we use Scripture metaphysically and metaphorically to represent things in our lives outside of us and in our inner world. And I've said it, I think, in the last video, that we can use anything, not just Scripture, this way. In Unity churches, every few years, it's hip to take some popular culture thing and get metaphysical with it. I remember when I was starting my journey in ministry, the Metaphysics of the Wizard of Oz was popular. And there have been times when Star Wars was popular to do metaphysically, and Harry Potter was hot for a moment. Not too long ago, in the pre-COVID days, which actually probably means about a year ago, I did a metaphysical interpretation of the first week of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhoods broadcasts. And I think I did this because the teasers for the Mr. Rogers movie was out, so it seemed like a cool thing to do, and I realized no one had done a metaphysical interpretation of Mr. Rogers' show, so I thought it would be fun to do. So I looked at the very first week of his show and did a metaphysical interpretation of it, and it was really fitting because the first week is about a capricious, ego-driven ruler who wants to build a wall. And another one that might actually be the next video I do in the series is a metaphysical interpretation of my recipe for Thanksgiving turkey gravy and how it relates to having gratitude, having an attitude of gratitude in our lives. And I happen to be a passionate cook, a hobby chef. I'm a foodie. So I actually had turned the recipe on how I make gravy into the sermon. So my hope and my plan is, since this is actually the week and a day, I believe, before Thanksgiving, is to actually do it. And I may do the entire sermon and then post it either Wednesday of Thanksgiving or Thanksgiving morning. So that's pretty much the end of this video. I wanted to give you a background, like I said, of various concepts and ideas that we use in metaphysical Christianity before we get into the whole Grown Up God series, which is coming soon. There may be other parts of this too where I might talk about sin as a concept or other things besides pure metaphysics, just to give you a background. So a lot of things are being built up as they go along, so there may be some concepts that I might want to throw out as short 10-minute videos or 30-minute videos just to give you an idea before we jump into this whole concept of where I'm going with the notion of having an adult relationship with the divine. So that's it for now. Stand by for other videos coming soon. So I just want to say, bless you all. Thanks.